Hello everybody and welcome to another Twilight Zone review. Today it is Season 3, Episode 10, The Midnight Sun, written by Rod Serling, and starring Lois Nettleton as Norma and Betty Gard as Mrs. Bronson. And I'm just going to tell a very short story here before I start getting into what happens in this episode. This is definitely one of my all-time favorite Twilight Zone episodes, and I'm going to tell you the reason why. When I decided back quite a few years ago that I was going to watch every Twilight Zone in its entirety, I knew certain things about some of the famous episodes, although I had never seen them. And I saw a lot of really good episodes, in the first 2+ seasons. But when I got to The Midnight Sun, it was an episode that I really felt transported me to being in the world that the episode portrayed, and that's the highest compliment I could give it. This episode is intense. And I remember being exhausted after I watched it for the first time. It really stood out to me. And it still does to this day. So we start with our main character, Norma, and she's in her apartment, and she's painting a picture that has the sun in it, and it is really hot. We can just tell it's really hot from the way she's sweating and just the atmosphere. So she opens the door, and we are introduced to our other main character, Mrs. Bronson, and we also see a family, and we find out that they are the last ones in the building and they are going to be leaving to try and find a safer place where it's not as hot. Obviously, we also find out that Mrs. Bronson and Norma are not leaving and they will be the only two people left, in that place of residence. And then we get the opening narration and we find out that what's happening is the Earth is somehow moving closer to the sun. It's never explained, but I'll get into that later. So basically everyone is doomed. That's always nice and pleasant to think about. So we go to our two main women and they're by themselves, and we find out, Norma went to the store. She says there's no checkouts there. You just take what you can get and you leave. So things must really be bad. People aren't using money anymore. She's able to get some juice and some food. She says at least they'll be okay there for the time being. And you can tell Mrs. Bronson is really, really rattled. After a while, the ladies are just walking around. You really get a sense and an illusion of the heat. They did a great job in this episode. And we get a radio report. They say, there's not really a lot of law enforcement anymore. Be on the lookout, for crazy people trying to break in. And we also learn that it's really hot. It's like over 100 degrees, and the forecast in the near future is pretty much the same. It's all just hot and heat. And the guy on the radio sounds pretty panicked as well. There's not really any hope in this world at all at this point. Very bleak. So the ladies are talking mostly just about heat. That's definitely the theme of this episode. And they seem to be sweating even more and more. Mrs. Bronson sees the painting of the sun. She basically loses it. She throws the painting down and tells Norma, paint something else. Don't paint the sun anymore. So we go to the next scene, and it seems like it's just getting hotter and hotter. And I just can't emphasize enough how, to me, this episode is so intense. I'm feeling it as it's going. And it's so hot that Norma puts her hand, it looks like on maybe a windowsill near the window, and she burns her hand. That's really hot. So everything's just going the same, and then the women hear footsteps, and there's a man outside. Of course, the women don't know what he wants. They're leery, and Norma tells him she has a gun and he better leave. So not thinking, the man says he'll leave, but he really doesn't. So Mrs. Bronson mistakenly lets him in. She opens the door. The man wrestles the gun away from Norma. He takes out some water and he uses it all, which is a pretty shady thing to do. But then we learn that this guy's losing it. He lost his wife and his child from the heat, and this guy's pretty much given up hope. This scene's handled very well, in my opinion. But then the man leaves, and you can just see pretty much humanity has no real hope at this point. So we are introduced, Mrs. Bronson sees a new picture. Norma says she just painted it recently, and it's of a waterfall. And Mrs. Bronson obviously likes it, but you can tell at the same time she's just pretty much done. She starts talking about water, and eventually she collapses. So now Norma's really upset, and this is actually my favorite scene in the episode. The painting starts melting, and they show the sun and the thermostat, and we just get an illusion that everything's melting, and I feel like I'm melting right along with it. To me, one of the all-time best Twilight Zone scenes. And eventually Norma passes out. And then we see snow, which is a huge contrast. We find out that Norma has been, out of it because she had a high fever, but now she's coming around. But what we really find out is that the opposite was happening. The Earth is going away from the sun, and everything is going to freeze because there'll be no sun at all. So Norma talks about how she had a dream of the midnight sun, and she says, "Isn't the coolness wonderful?" And Mrs. Bronson says, "Yes, it's wonderful, but we know it's really not." Now, this episode just really impacted me on a great level. I know that's a personal thing. It may not do that to everybody, but I just love the intensity and unique feel. To me, this is another one of those episodes that feels like a short film, which is a compliment. Anytime in this era of TV that you can get something that's theatrical quality, because TV wasn't like it is now. TV had much smaller budgets back then, and it felt different from film. That's not a knock, that's just the way it is. But this episode feels like a short theatrical film, which is only a compliment. And when people ask me why I love Twilight Zone, this is one of the first episodes I always mention. Now, I've learned to understand through time this episode does have, a few small issues. First of all, it's never explained how the sun is either, how it's doing either thing, getting colder or hotter. And I've come to learn, the science of all this is somewhat questionable. That's really the biggest problem with the episode. Some people might find that unsatisfactory. And that's a fair point. But to me, it doesn't really matter, because when I think of Twilight Zone, I think of Midnight Sun, and that's the best compliment I can give any episode. So I give the Midnight Sun a 4.5 out of 5. So 4.5 out of 5 for this episode. And if you'd like in the comments, let me know what episodes had a great impact on you the first time you watched them. Definitely check this one out. Thanks for watching.